What is society? This is the first question we need to answer in sociology. And society is everyone within a certain country, group, area. Usually we think of it in terms of British society in sociology versus other nations, but sometimes we use smaller groups, particularly when we're looking at, say, education. We might compare the society as a whole, as the whole of the country. We might think of one particular school as a society. Regardless, we do this and then we put people into groups. The acronym CAGES is the best way to remember this. What class do we have? That comes along with status and where people are and what it means to belong. Age. When we divide people into different age groups, why is it? What does it mean to be a child versus an old person versus an adult, etc., etc. Gender, not just biological sex, but gender in terms of how people live their lives and assume certain roles and characteristics. Ethnicity, the background, culture of different people. And even sexuality, we may talk about this in terms of minorities and how it links to family and other areas of society, crime and deviance too as well. So you want to be using these categories in every lesson and thinking about how do we define society, how do we take all these different groups of people, different ideas, different identities, and where do they overlap, where do they fit together, where do they not. This is our keyword and definitions chart for CAGES. See if you can memorize these definitions, see if you can make them better, more detailed, add examples, get used to using these key terms in class and throughout your work. Think about the pictures below and how they link to CAGES and what it is that sociologists do with all of these We moved on to this question of who has the most power in Britain. So debating whether or not the monarchy, the Queen in this case, has more power than Parliament compared to, say, celebrities, and who influences you personally, who influences the country as a whole, and what it means to have different types of power and different types of influence. Compare that to your parents and a form of everyday power, if you like, and it suddenly becomes clear that there's not a right and wrong here. There's not a structure where it's very obvious and power is very clear and easy to see every day. So we looked at different types of status as well. The monarchy have something called ascribed status. They inherit it. They haven't earned it necessarily. It's passed on through birth and through title, through family. Parliament, you could argue, is achieved status because people have to get elected to become into Parliament. And then celebrities, often again it's achieved status. They've done something, they've had some sort of career where they've earned their fame, they've earned their money, they've earned their power. So think carefully about what that means and why we listen to these people or why we don't, and how they can affect your life in a big or a small way. The question of who is Britain is a little bit difficult to answer, really. But remember when we made predictions about different groups, different genders, different ethnicities, ages, religions, etc., most people were wildly wrong. So this idea that Britain is not universally the same, it's different in different regions, and your experience of growing up in Manchester, for example, might give you a different impression or a different assumption about the rest of the country, and vice versa if you grew up somewhere else, as I did. So remember that Britain is very diverse, but is largely still very much white, British-born people who have a shared culture and a shared heritage, which is very complex and very rich. And we measure changes over time, and we look at what that means and how that affects all sorts of aspects of society. Taking official statistics, this is statistics collected by the government, we looked at how Manchester breaks down in terms of gender and what this means. So most people in Manchester are aged 20 to 30 years old, according to the last census, and it's a roughly even gender split. Now this is slightly different when we look at the rest of the country, but it doesn't vary too much. And then we talked about other societies and other countries and why the gender split might be more pronounced and more in favour of males or females, and what that could tell us about different countries. So by measuring how many men and women there are in a country and combining that with age, we can start to build up a detailed picture of the population and make some guesses and start drawing up some conclusions about what our society is like. We can see from here that Britain has a huge diversity, or lots and lots of different ethnicities, and we can link that to our history with the British Empire and the fact that a lot of people want to move to Britain, and once they settle and they have children, it then becomes difficult to know who exactly is an immigrant, for example, who's a second generation immigrant and who's been here a long time, just by looking at cold hard stats. But we can look at trends and patterns, and it's very, very clear here that even the largest group of ethnic minority is described as white other, and that's only 4.5%. Most of these different groups make up less than 1% of the population. So it shows that Britain is incredibly diverse, and we can see from that there's lots has changed in modern times. And there's then combining that with another aspect of our cages. By measuring the gender, we see that there are bigger gaps, as mentioned previously, in terms of the male-female split and what that might tell us about the people moving here, the cultures of those people. We can start to really build a clear picture of what Britain is like. By looking at the ages of people and the trends of the population, so the proportion of people under 16 and over 65 and in between, we can make assumptions and we can measure things like quality of life, life expectancy. We can look at how technology, medicine, the living standards in Manchester and the rest of the country may have changed, may have improved, may have got worse, and which groups of people it affects more and why. So measuring age is really important. You can see here that as age changes in terms of the amount of people versus the proportion, it gives us a clear indicator of, is the population getting older? What does that mean when it comes to working age, pension, taxes, strain on the NHS? These are all questions that we might want to look at and think about in sociology, and things that the government and other agencies and other companies will look at and think about. Measuring religion might seem like a pointless thing to do these days. The concept of secularization, that everyone's becoming less religious, is fairly assumed. And if you look, the idea that Britain is a Christian country, but is only 60% Christian, is something that we want to discuss. The next biggest group is to have no religion at all. And if you look at the history of Britain and how religious Britain used to be, and how that changed our wars and criminal justice system and family life and all these other things we look at in terms of sociology, even schools, faith schools is another good example. How religious a country isn't necessarily the same as who identifies with each religion. You can designate yourself as Christian, Muslim, or any other religion, but you might be incredibly devout, or you might just be culturally belonging to that group and feel that you put that down on the form. So how data is gathered, how it's interpreted is really key, and religion is a good example of those kind of questions and what it can mean. Some of the other ways we can look at what society is like, particularly British society, is to look at stereotypes around Britain, British life, British people, the effect of the empire. 100 years ago, Britain still ruled probably a quarter of the globe, give or take. And again, those of you studying history will know exactly how important that was and what that meant for British society, British people, British politics, and British wealth, power, status, all of those things. link into Britishness and the influence those have on other countries. Former colonies like India, for example, if you think about all the countries that speak English that have links to Britain via trade, via the monarchy, etc., etc., it gives a very, very different picture of Britain and Britishness from the outside that maybe people here living in Britain don't always appreciate or think about. And that again links to class and power, the fact we still have a monarchy, the fact that we have massive inequality in terms of wealth throughout the country. That can also then feed into ideas around diversity. What's changed in Britain in terms of the way the population is made up, the number of people, where they come from, what kind of money they have, what kind of lifestyle they have, what they do for work, and what it's like to live in Britain, because that changes rapidly in the 20th century and into the 21st century. The nature versus nurture debate is probably one of the most fundamental and basic things in sociology. Basic might be the wrong word. It's one of the most important, certainly, and we come to it with this idea of, is human nature, is human society, is the way we are basically down to what's in our genes, what's in our DNA, or is it our environment, how we're brought up? And the interaction between all of the elements of cages can be used to highlight differences, to measure differences, to think about what it really means to live in our society, and where do all these ideas come from? Why do these changes happen? Some sociologists may argue in terms of nature, but generally speaking, a lot of emphasis is placed on nurture and the interaction of all these different factors. The class that you're born into, the time that you're born into, the gender that you are, the ethnicity that you are, where you move to, the jobs that you take because of the education you have and the lifestyle that you're used to living. So there's lots of keywords up there. Use them to help you identify what's most important to you, and why the nature versus nurture debate is so key. If you think about the way boys and girls act, is that because of genetics? Is that because of environment? Think about toys, clothes, books, etc., etc. And how does that impact the rest of our lives and our wider society, our stereotypes, and everything else, basically. So spend some time thinking about nature versus nurture and your own ideas and your own experiences, and decide how important you think it is. Informal control versus formal control. We've talked about deviance elsewhere. Think about the punishments that you have in society for different acts. There's formal punishment such as prison and a criminal record, but more often than not there's informal punishment too, and this links to control, the reaction of other people, disapproval, rejection, being ignored, being cut out of a group, ostracized. That kind of informal control can govern our behaviour far more than the threat of going to court or going to prison, because it's more for smaller everyday things. So you need to think about what's more important, what governs people's behaviour, queuing in a shop, manners, that type of thing, versus something more serious such as crime. So when we look at deviance, when we look at behaviour, when we look at norms and values, we're looking at influence and the influence of different types of control. And those fall into these two categories of informal and formal. Formal tends to be written down rules, hence the law being the most obvious example, whereas informal can change depending on who you're with, where you're at, what you're doing, who you are, etc., etc. If you really want to understand formal control, think about the agencies of formal control, the places and the institutions which enforce it. So think about the different roles of the House of Parliament, Manchester Prison, Crown Court, Manchester Police Station. Why would anyone go there? What would they go there for? What's the job of these places? What's the job of the people who work in these places? How does that affect the rest of society? So you want to think about, why would you end up there? What would it mean? What happens there? And what effects does that have on the rest of us and the rest of society? So look into all of these different places if you're not sure what they do, and think about, in terms of scale. House of Parliament obviously affects everyone in the country, it affects the whole laws. but the local police station is only going to affect certain people within a small area. Informal social control can be hard to explain, but it's really easy to experience, and tends to come from our family, our peers, our life at school, when we're out in public. The way you behave in these different settings and the way you interact with the people within those settings will be wildly different, and will often govern how you behave, how you think, what you do, what you say, etc., etc. So if you think about in terms of language, clothes, activities, what would you do in front of your family, in front of your peers, when you're in the classroom, when you're out in public, and what would you not do? And why is that governed by those different agencies of social control? Why is it governed by what your family may say or think or do, what your peers may say or think or do, what your classmates, teachers, etc., etc.? You get the idea. So informal social control governs us in a much more immediate, everyday level. Therefore, it's quite easy to look around and see it everywhere. How society has changed over time is a really easy way to measure different parts of society, to measure changes in values and norms, and to think about what that means. So I've picked the 1960s, the Industrial Revolution, because if you compare either of those to today, you can see massive changes to the class system, to gender norms and values, to family size, to wealth, to inequality, to poverty, to living conditions, and ideas about rich and poor and what we value in society. So particularly those of you who study history, again, will probably find this very easy, but if you think about the Industrial Revolution and you think about what happened in Manchester, and you think about, say, the 60s, an era where my parents were then being born and growing up in, they're very different times, yet there's some things that stay the same, such as poverty, such as social inequality, such as the idea of staying in your class particularly, still being quite common. So pick any era you like and then measure how different groups are treated and use cages to do that. You know, in Victorian Britain, the idea of children being seen and not heard, children were either put into factories and sent to work or disregarded, really, depending on where they were in the social system. It was in the 60s you get the rise of the teenager and more the identity specifically there for children, having their own music, their own clothes, their own TV shows and tastes, and that's down to technology and many other things. So always think about what's changed over time and what can that tell us as a sociologist. This is an interesting question. How do we decide what society should be like? Well, in our society we have democracy, we have votes, we can change things politically. But then there's a lot of criticism about the political system and who it's ruled by and how unfair it can be. Social media has massively changed society in a very short space of time. Concepts such as trolling, such as bullying and harassment, the idea of the selfie and the image-based reality of social media and unreality of social media, what people say and do on social media compared to their real life can be very different. Our laws and criminal justice system, the changes to that, what used to be illegal, how we used to treat criminals, the fact we used to have the death penalty shows our values have changed. And what we do for jobs, people used to do very manual based jobs, lots of factory work, lots of labouring, lots of farm work before that, going back hundreds if not thousands of years. Now with the advent of computers and changes to industry, the workplace in Britain is very, very different. And also think of concepts like the gender pay gap and women in the workplace now, how that's changed, what that shows about our society. So there's the change there, and people go along with things through choice often. And that's one of the big debates. How much choice do they have? How much influence do they have? And by making different choices, we can impact what our society should be like. So this is one of probably the harder concepts in sociology. But think about changes over time. Think about changes to values, beliefs, and norms and behaviour. And then what impact does that have for you and me and our decisions? The concept of society being like a body comes from sociologists called functionalists. We'll talk about functionalists in greater detail as time goes on. But these are sociologists that see society working in a way like a human body. You've got all these different parts of the bodies with different jobs that are all interconnected, and if one part gets sick or one part doesn't work, the whole body may die. And they see society as like this. So you've got all these different institutions like the government, schools, families, the law, all these different institutions, all these different parts, and if one of them's broken or one of them isn't working as well as they should, that can affect the whole of society, the whole of the body. It's a really interesting idea, and one which does have quite a lot of merit and is worth exploring. You might want to think about it and see how much you agree with it. What are the problems with thinking of society like this, and what are the benefits of it? Building on the idea of the organic model and society being like a body, we need to ask, what is social conflict? Why might there be violence? Why might there be inequality? Why might there be discrimination, prejudice in a society? What does it tell us about that society? What does it tell us about the people who do it and the people who are victims of it? So any form of conflict in society can be called social conflict. And you need to understand this concept and understand there's two main types of perspective in sociology. Consensus sociology, where you look for agreement and things that are going well and things that are going right in society, and conflict sociology, where a group's oppressed or marginalised or treated unfairly, and how can we fix that, how can we change things. I hope this video has been really useful. Please give me comments, please give me questions, please ask me for any help that you need. This is everything that we're going to cover in the first introductory part of GCSE Sociology, and hopefully this gives you a really good understanding of the big ideas and the basic concepts.